Hello friends, welcome back. First of all, tell me where in the world you're watching my video from. The Mornings had learned Cullen Cox before anyone else did. They rose with him, quiet and unassuming, carrying the same soft light through the same windows, asking nothing and promising even less. In his late 60s, he lived alone in a house that still remembered another heartbeat. The floors knew where his wife used to walk. The walls held conversations that no longer returned answers. Every day began the same way, not because he loved routine, but because routine was easier than remembering why it existed. On the morning of the call, he made tea the way he always did, letting the kettle sing just long enough to feel useful. He straightened the dining room without thinking, aligning chairs that would not be pulled out, smoothing a tablecloth no one else would touch. His wife had liked things neat when company came over, and even now, years after she was gone, his hands obeyed that old instinct. The light filtered through the window, gently, pale and forgiving, settling across the table as if trying to soften the lines time had carved into his face. He stood there for a moment, cup warming his palms, and allowed himself something dangerous: hope. Not the loud kind that makes promises, but the quiet kind that slips in unnoticed and sits heavy in the chest. He was waiting for the screen to come alive, waiting for his son's face to appear, waiting for proof that distance had not yet turned into disappearance. When the video finally connected, Fielding and Jenna sat side by side at their kitchen table. Their home looked tidy in a way that felt intentional, curated. Fielding smiled, the same familiar curve Cullen had watched grow from boyhood into adulthood, though now it seemed practiced, like a gesture pulled from memory rather than feeling. Jenna offered a nod that was polite enough to count as greeting, but brief enough to end it. They spoke about safe things: the weather, work schedules, a neighbor Cullen had never met. Words moved between them like furniture being rearranged. Necessary, functional, but stripped of warmth. Cullen tried to fill the spaces where silence threatened to settle. He told a short story about a bird that had landed on his fence that morning, laughed softly at his own attempt to sound light. Jenna stayed quiet, her eyes occasionally drifting away from the screen, as if the conversation were something happening behind her rather than in front of her. When she did speak, it was usually after Fielding glanced her way, as if checking whether the moment allowed it. A few minutes into the call, Fielding's phone buzzed. He excused himself with an apologetic smile and stepped out of frame. The moment he left, something shifted. The air on Cullen's side of the screen felt colder, though nothing in the room had changed. Jenna did not move closer to the camera. She did not soften her voice. From somewhere, just out of view, her words came low and sharp, each one placed with intention. She said she could not stand him. She said she did not want him visiting again. Cullen did not react. He stayed exactly where he was, hands wrapped around his cup, shoulders still. The words did not feel like a knife. Knives are sudden. This was something colder, something that pressed slowly into his chest and stayed there, forcing his breath to change. It was the kind of hurt that makes the world quiet rather than loud. Before he could find a response, Fielding returned. Jenna's tone smoothed itself instantly, as if nothing had happened at all. The conversation resumed, lighter on the surface, hollow underneath. Cullen followed along, nodding, smiling when expected, carrying the weight of what he had just heard alone. When the call ended, the screen went dark, and the room returned to its original stillness. Only now it felt heavier. That night, a message arrived from Jenna's phone. It was brief, clinical, a request that he call before visiting in the future. No explanation, no apology, just the clear, unmistakable sense of a boundary being drawn where one had never existed before. Cullen read the message again and again, each time feeling it settle deeper, like sediment sinking to the bottom of still water. He sat at the kitchen table long after the light outside had faded, the house wrapped in a quiet that felt almost accusatory. Somewhere between the ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator, the truth settled into place. He was no longer welcome in his son's life, and he could not remember when that door had begun to close. After his wife passed, Fielding had been young, standing at the edge of adulthood with more questions than certainty. Cullen had told him to stay focused on school, to build something solid for himself, even though every part of him wanted his son close. He had buried his wife alone, kept the business running alone, held grief and responsibility in the same hands without ever letting either show. He never told Fielding how hard those years were. He believed protection meant silence. When Fielding first brought Jenna home, she had seemed kind, thoughtful, the kind of person who asked polite questions and listened just enough to appear interested. Over time, small gaps began to appear. Holidays slipped past with brief calls instead of visits. Conversations shortened. Invitations arrived later, if they arrived at all. When Cullen visited their home, he noticed photographs on the walls that no longer included him. Conversations bent around him instead of toward him. None of it arrived all at once. Distance gathered quietly, the way dust does, until it was everywhere. Sitting there that night, phone dim in his hand, Cullen felt that distance finally settle into something solid. He did not argue. He did not respond with anything other than courtesy. Whatever was happening between them required understanding, not reaction. Still, the silence pressed in on him, heavier than it had ever been, and he wondered how a family could drift apart without anyone noticing until the space between them became too wide to cross. From that moment on, Jenna's politeness revealed itself for what it was, a thin layer covering something colder. When Cullen visited, she spoke with the careful courtesy reserved for endings. She stepped aside just enough to let him in, then drifted into another room, leaving him standing in hallways that once felt warm when Fielding first moved in. Fielding remained quiet during these visits. His answers were short. His eyes flicked toward Jenna before settling on his father, as if seeking permission to say more. It was a strange thing, watching his own son hesitate in his presence. The closeness they once shared thinned out in increments, so small they were almost invisible. Weeks passed without calls. Messages went unanswered longer than before. When they did speak, the conversations felt rehearsed, stripped of ease. Cullen told himself not to imagine reasons. He told himself love did not vanish overnight. But the house felt larger with each passing day, its rooms echoing with the absence of voices that once filled them. Jenna often spoke about her job during those visits. She worked at a large construction corporation, she said, describing meetings that stretched long into the evening and decisions that carried weight. She made sure everyone understood the level of responsibility she carried. Cullen listened without interruption, without correction. He never told her that the company she spoke of so confidently was the same one he had built with his wife decades ago, the same one he had stepped back from when grief made the world smaller. Still, something in her stories felt wrong. Vendor names did not match any he remembered. Weekend travel sounded more like leisure than obligation. She mentioned budgets shifting and people needing careful management in ways that felt rehearsed rather than lived. Cullen did not confront her. He simply noticed. The details collected in his mind like small stones that did not belong together. One afternoon, after a visit that left him feeling less like a father and more like an inconvenience, Cullen sat in his truck before driving away. The sun hung low, the air heavy with the promise of rain. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and let the silence stretch. Something deeper was moving beneath the surface of their lives, something that had begun long before Jenna's whispered resentment. He could feel it now, slow and deliberate, pulling threads he did not yet understand. That evening, he called Ethan Wells. Ethan had worked with him for years and knew the company better than anyone Cullen trusted. He asked him to quietly look into Jenna's recent projects, her decisions, her paper trail. Ethan did not ask why. He simply agreed, his voice steady, professional. When the call ended, the house returned to stillness. The clock read close to 7:30. The rooms around him carried the same quiet ache he felt in his chest. Cullen did not know what Ethan would uncover, but he knew the unraveling of his family was not just about harsh words or forgotten visits. Something more precise was at work, something that would not remain hidden forever. And as the night deepened around him, Cullen sat alone with a realization that refused to loosen its grip. Sometimes the greatest betrayals do not announce themselves at all. They arrive disguised as distance, patience, and silence. And by the time you feel them clearly, you are already standing on the wrong side of the door. If the space between a father and his son could grow this wide without a single argument, then what else had been breaking quietly, right in front of him? The building rose from the city like a finished thought, all glass and steel, clean lines reflecting a sky that never lingered long enough to soften it. Cullen arrived just after 9, his footsteps measured, his posture unchanged by the years that had passed since the place was born from blueprints and risk. The lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and filtered air. Everything gleamed. Everything felt distant. He nodded to the receptionist as he passed. She smiled politely, professional, unaware of the history walking by her desk. That anonymity struck him harder than he expected. There was a time when his name alone had carried weight in these halls. He had wanted it that way once, to fade quietly, to let the company outgrow him. Standing there now, he wondered if distance always came with a cost no one warned you about. Ethan met him at the elevator, a slim folder tucked under his arm. The look he gave Cullen was not alarmed, but it was heavy, prepared. They rode up in silence, the low hum of cables filling the space between them. With each floor, memories surfaced uninvited. Late nights with rolled sleeves, laughter echoing through unfinished rooms, his wife's hand brushing his as they walked these same corridors, imagining something that did not yet exist. The elevator doors opened onto a floor that felt colder than the rest. The conference room waited at the end of the hall, already alive with muted voices. Inside, department heads filled seats along the long table, papers spread before them, eyes drifting toward the screen at the front. Fielding sat near the center, shoulders slightly hunched, confusion etched into his expression. He looked tired in a way Cullen recognized, the fatigue that comes not from work but from pressure you do not fully understand. Jenna stood near the presentation screen, tablet in hand, composed and assured. When she noticed Cullen, she offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. To her, he was still just an advisor from the trust, a figure she believed she understood well enough to manage. That assumption settled heavily in his chest. Ethan took the seat beside Cullen and placed the folder on the table with deliberate care. The room quieted as he began to speak, his voice steady as he outlined the findings of his investigation. He started with numbers. Vendor payments that did not align. Invoices inflated beyond reason. Companies that existed only on paper. Each detail landed softly at first, then harder, building momentum. Heads began to turn. Jenna shifted her weight, her fingers tightening around her tablet. When she interrupted, her voice was sharp, demanding to know Ethan's sources. He did not falter. He continued, moving from anomalies to patterns, from questions to evidence. The air in the room thickened, every breath suddenly aware of itself. Jenna accused Cullen of orchestrating the audit out of spite. She suggested personal issues at home had clouded his judgment. Her words carried an edge meant to cut authority from beneath him, to frame the moment as retaliation rather than responsibility. She insisted the trust had no place questioning her decisions. As she spoke, she turned toward Fielding, searching his face for support. Fielding looked lost. When Jenna's gaze returned to Cullen, bitterness sharpened her tone. She spoke of workload and risk, of sacrifices she claimed no one else understood. Cullen listened without interruption. When she finished, he opened the folder Ethan had placed before him. Inside were documents that told a quieter, more damning story. A private property purchase disguised as a business expense, travel records untethered from any project, patterns that left little room for doubt. He pushed the papers forward. The silence that followed stretched thin and fragile. Someone shifted in their chair. Jenna's face drained of color, though her chin remained lifted. She denied everything, claiming a setup, her eyes flashing with anger as they moved from Ethan to Cullen. The room waited. No one rushed to defend her. Fielding leaned forward, hands clasped tightly, his voice low but strained. He asked what any of this had to do with him. Why an advisor from the trust was sitting in their board meeting. His question hovered in the air, heavy with something like fear. Every eye turned to Cullen. For a moment, he hesitated. Not because he doubted the truth, but because he understood what it would take from his son once spoken aloud. Then he told them he was not there as an advisor. He told them he had founded the company with his wife long before most of them had been hired, that he had stepped aside for personal reasons, keeping oversight through the trust. The reaction was immediate. Chairs creaked, hands lifted to mouths. A whisper rippled near the window. Jenna stared at him, as if he had spoken in a language she did not recognize. Fielding's face tightened, disbelief and pain colliding in his eyes. Cullen continued, his voice calm, outlining the pattern of misconduct and the steps that would follow. He did not raise his voice. He did not soften the truth. He watched Fielding sag back into his chair, fingers gripping the edge of the table, as if something essential had been pulled from him. Jenna attempted to speak again, but the words faltered. She closed her tablet and sat, stunned, the space around her suddenly colder. Ethan gathered the papers as the room slowly emptied, footsteps quiet, goodbyes unsure. Cullen remained seated until the last chair was pushed in, listening to the distant hum of the building he once helped raise. When Fielding finally met his gaze, the hurt there cut deeper than any accusation. He asked why Cullen had never told him. Cullen answered honestly. He wanted his son to build a life free from the weight of legacy, to choose love without wondering about money. Fielding looked away, absorbing the truth piece by piece. The meeting ended, but nothing felt finished. A few days later, Fielding moved out of the house he shared with Jenna. The message he sent was brief, asking for space and time. Cullen read it alone at the kitchen table, unsure whether he had saved his son from harm or pushed him into a pain he was not ready to face. Justice had come quietly, but it had shaken everything. And Cullen could not escape the question pressing into him now. When truth finally arrives, does it heal, or does it only reveal what was already broken? The house learned Fielding's absence before Cullen did. It settled into the corners, stretched itself across the empty chair at the table, lingered in the hallway where footsteps no longer passed. When the message arrived late in the evening, short, careful, asking for space, Cullen read it more than once, not because it was unclear, but because it felt unreal. Words could be reread. Silence could not. He sat there long after the screen dimmed, the clock ticking with a patience that felt almost cruel. Most fathers spend their lives trying to protect their children. Cullen had believed that protection meant distance from weight, from legacy, from truths that could bend a young life before it had found its shape. Now he wondered if protection and control had worn the same face all along. The thought stayed with him as the lights went out, lingering in the dark like a question that refused to sleep. The mornings that followed arrived without ceremony. Cullen woke before the sun, as he always had, his body still obedient to habits formed decades earlier. He made coffee out of instinct, listening to the slow drip echo through the kitchen. The clock read 6:40 when he sat down, mug warming his hands, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Even familiar sounds failed to settle the unease pressing against his chest. He wondered if he had carried too much for Fielding over the years, if shielding him from the company's history had taken something essential instead of giving freedom. He wondered whether honesty delayed too long becomes its own form of betrayal. The questions circled quietly, each one leaving a small ache behind. By midweek, silence had settled into routine. Cullen took long walks in the afternoons, letting the cold air sting his face just enough to remind him he was still present in his own life. The streets were calm, neighbors polite but distant, everyone wrapped in their own private worlds. It felt easier to be outside, where absence blended into open space instead of echoing off walls. It was during one of those evenings, just after 7, when his phone buzzed unexpectedly. He expected Fielding's name. Instead, it was Jenna's. For a moment, Cullen simply stared at the screen, his breath shallow, his hands still. He had not heard from her since the meeting. He was not sure what form her word would take now. The email was brief, stripped of the sharpness that once defined her voice. She apologized for the things she had said about him. She admitted that fear had guided her actions more than reason. She wrote about her own father, a man who had forced himself into every corner of her life, who had used guilt as leverage until her mother disappeared beneath it. She promised herself no parent would ever hold that kind of power over her again. Somewhere along the way, she wrote, she began to see Cullen through that same shadow. Cullen read the message slowly, letting each sentence land without resistance. The resentment he had felt toward her loosened, replaced by something quieter and heavier, understanding. Pain, he realized, often arrives disguised as certainty. He felt no urge to argue, no need to correct her version of events. He saw now that her cruelty had not been personal. It had been inherited. He replied simply. He wished her healing. He hoped she found peace in places that had never been safe for her. He did not offer reconciliation. He did not reopen doors that had closed for reasons beyond anger. Boundaries, he knew now, were not punishments. They were acknowledgments of reality. The days that followed felt lighter, though Fielding remained distant. Cullen resisted the urge to reach out again, knowing his son needed time to sort through the wreckage of a life he thought he understood. Love, Cullen reminded himself, does not always announce itself through action. Sometimes it waits. Then, one morning just after 9, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. Cullen opened it to find Fielding standing on the porch, hands buried in his pockets, eyes tired in a way that reached deeper than exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not hostile, but it was fragile, like thin glass waiting for a careless touch. Fielding finally said he was ready to talk. The words were simple, but they carried more honesty than anything he had said in months. Cullen stepped aside, letting him in. As Fielding crossed the threshold, the house felt warmer, as if something essential had returned without ceremony. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Cullen had spent so many nights wondering if he had lost his son for good. Fielding looked around slowly, taking in the familiar space with new eyes. When he finally looked up, Cullen saw both the boy he had raised and the man he was becoming, coexisting uneasily. Cullen told him he had never wanted to control his life, that everything he had done, every silence, every omission, had come from a desire to stand beside him without casting a shadow. Fielding listened, nodding slowly, absorbing the truth without interruption. His smile, when it came, was uncertain but real. It was not forgiveness. It was not resolution. It was a beginning, fragile, imperfect, and honest. As Fielding sat there, Cullen understood something he had spent years avoiding. Love does not protect by hiding the truth. It protects by trusting someone to carry it. And sometimes, the greatest act of care is allowing another person to see you clearly, even when that clarity hurts. The house did not return to what it had been. It did not need to. It held something quieter now. Not certainty, not closure, but possibility. And for Cullen, that was enough. Because some families do not come back together with noise or apologies. They return through silence, patience, and the courage to stay open, even when the past has already done its damage.